Thanks for joining us today. And we want to talk about the API program that we have at Intuit and share the learnings with you. Before we start, a quick introduction. My name is Suresh Muthu. I'm a principal engineer in Intuit, and I have been working in the Intuit data exchange platform. And my work is mainly on acquiring the data, mainly from data providers, enriching the data, standardizing and normalizing it, making it available for Intuit products.
Thanks, and I'm Cheney. I'm a distinguished engineer at Intuit, and I have been at this a long time. When Keith was sharing his timelines this morning, it was kind of funny because I'm like, oh yeah, I remember living through that and that and that. And I love getting systems to be able to speak with one another. That's why I love working in the API space. And in my spare time, I have a dual sport motorcycle that I use to explore the back roads of Boise, Idaho, where I am based. And Lucy is not able to be with us here today. She was not feeling well, and so we're going to cover for her, but I wanted to flash her information up on the screen. She's one of our developer advocates, so if you have questions or things that you want to talk about from an external consumer of our APIs, then she's the one to get in touch with. So we'll have her information further on in the slide as well. So we're going to go through 4 highlight areas around having a successful GraphQL API program. We're going to talk about what we mean when we say an API program. I'm going to touch upon the guidelines, principles, and rules that we have set up, how we enforce and facilitate things via automation and tooling, and then we're going to talk about our training and how we build a community around this. Before we do that, though, Intuit, these are a few of the products that we produce at Intuit. You may recognize some of them. Just wanted to give you a sense of who we are and what type of work we do. We're a fintech platform. And give you a little bit of context. This is really just a vanity slide, but we do a lot of APIs, you can see here. The interesting thing to point out here is you can see that we do have a lot of GraphQL API traffic. It's a fairly small percentage today out of our overall API traffic. Intuit is we like to say Intuit is like a 40-year tech startup company. We've been around for so long. We've got so many different APIs and ways that we interact with our partners and things like that. But GraphQL is somewhere that we've been implementing and dedicating some time since around 2017. And we've got a lot of learnings and a lot of broken bones and bodies along the way, but we're coming out of it strong, and we're kind of at a point now where we're ready to do a refresh and make a heavier investment into GraphQL for our future.
Thanks, Jared. Let's talk about API program. What is an API program, and why did we start one? As Jared said, Intuit is a 40 years old technology company, and there are a lot of legacy services and APIs that we deal with. We deal with a lot of backward compatibility and others in terms of services and APIs. It's always cushy to put a governance process or an API program when it comes to REST APIs. But when it came to GraphQL, we had the opportunity to start with a clean slate, and that's exactly what we did with the GraphQL API program. And previous slide, Jared talked about the API stats that Intuit had to deal with. And when we build our GraphQL APIs, they need to be built at Intuit scale. And to the GraphQL adoption at this scale required us to come up with this API program. And in this API program has 3 major components to it: the API guidelines and the best practices, tooling around those, and the learning programs that enable our community-driven developers reviewing code across the APIs. And we'll cover each of these sections in detail in this talk, and we want to share our learnings with you. And back to Jared talk about the guidelines.
Thank you. So we're going to be hitting on all of these areas at a fairly high level, because to go into much depth, it's going to take more time than we have just in this session. So I'll say, as we go through this, happy to take questions afterwards with whatever time we've got left, but Suresh and I will both be around the remainder of today and into this evening. Find us if you want to talk more depth about anything that we bring up here. as well as tomorrow. Very excited to be here together with everybody talking about these things and sharing ideas and problems and solutions and things. So, guidelines. We have a lot of developers at Intuit that work on different products, as you saw earlier. And when we got into the GraphQL space especially, we had different teams and different products working at different paces and implementing things that fit their use cases without a lot of opportunity or chance to do really deep collaboration on how we might want to make this work across the entire ecosystem. So we got kind of stuck for a couple of years trying to figure out, how do we move forward? If we need a composed graph across the entire ecosystem. How do we want to do that? Do we pick this solution that we already have or this other solution we already have? Or do we go with something new? And when it comes to guidelines and how we build out our schema, what do we adopt? And so we had to kind of take a step back and really holistically look at what are the principles and the guidelines that we can agree upon as an entire company that can help us level set those expectations we want everybody using going forward. And it was quite a journey to get there, but it's been a good one. We found, though, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar, as Captain Barbosa has explained to Elizabeth when she tries to invoke the pirate code, sometimes when you have rules and guidelines and you're trying to have conversations with your teams and saying, this is the way we need to do it, you're often going to get this response of, yeah, but it doesn't quite apply to us. Aren't those more just guidelines, not really hard rules that we need to follow? And so that is true. There's no set of guidelines or rules or codes that's going to cover every single situation that you have. But if you can at least align upon the principles, that helps the discussions move forward when you run into different things. And that kind of leads into the next piece that I want to talk about here is that it's very important that you identify as an organization, no matter how large or small you are, what we call one-way door or two-way door decisions. So some things are very easy to swap out later. Easy is relative, I understand that, but other things are much more difficult to change after you've let the horses out of the barn and you move forward. And so that was a Boise reference for all of you who didn't get that. So we've got one-way door decisions, really hard to walk back. That would be like your schema. Your schema, once it's out there and you have a lot of people using it, while it is possible, it's difficult and it takes a lot of communication and coordination with your users to move off of something if you decide that you need to change things. Adding to your schema is usually never a problem. We're talking about backwards incompatible changes and that sort of thing when you're trying to roll something back or delete it. Two-way door decisions, that's more like what technology stack are you working on? Is your GraphQL implemented in Java, or is it in Node, or is it PHP, or is it something else out there? Or even to the point of composition might be a little bit further away from a two-way door, a little bit more to the one-way door, but you can swap out how you're composing your supergraph without necessarily impacting your consumers. So the three audiences you need to keep in mind are your infrastructure teams, your developer teams, and then your consumers of your API. If you're touching all three of those, if all three of those are going to be impacted by something that you change, that's pretty likely a one-way door decision. Otherwise, if it gets to where you're only impacting one or none of those, and that's a two-way door, and you can move pretty quickly. When it comes to those one-way door decisions, we have several paradigms or tools, processes with which we handle these. And like I say, we can talk more about these later if you're curious, but DAISY is a big thing in our organization. That stands for a driver, an approver, contributors, and the informed. And then we have a new letter that's been added recently, an E for escalation, having an escalation path. The way this works is you identify when there's a one-way door decision that needs to be made, you put a timeline on it, you establish who's going to drive this decision, who do we need to be contributors to this to be able to help make that decision, and then there's one approver that gets identified that has the ability to say, out of the options presented, what they're going to go with. And everybody else, even if they disagree, we're all willing to commit and move forward. And then the I for informed are just those other additional stakeholders that need to be aware of the decision that was reached so that they aren't caught unawares by it later. We document these major decisions in architectural decision records, ADRs or just DRs. And then we also have a guidelines wiki that becomes the permanent, not very often changing record of the combination of all these different decisions that we can refer people to when somebody comes up and says, I don't really want to paginate my API. I only have 2,000 records that I'll get returned from that. It's like, well, let's look at the guidelines and see what they say. I don't know how to handle errors when they're coming up. Look at the guidelines, see what they say. And this becomes a standing record, and you get everybody kind of on board, and it's open internally for us so that anybody can submit a PR, make a suggestion, defend why they suggest either adding something or modifying it. We talk about it, and we either adopt or deny it and move on. Some topics are going to take more time than others. I picked a few here just to talk about at a high level. These are some not necessarily one-way door decisions, but they could be either one-way door decisions or they're highly contentious areas that you know it's going to take time for you to get people in your organization aligned on how they're handled. So error handling, especially in GraphQL, we have some pretty strong opinions here, but I think they've been well formed over a lot of debate over the last couple of years. But the main point I would highlight here is that we make a distinction between what we want to raise to the consumer by way of something that they need to adjust or change on their end as a user-facing error. For example, you can only have 24 hours in a day, so adjust the amount of time that you're trying to input and try again. The developer hasn't done anything wrong in that sense. They're just passing through the message to the user. That's a user-facing error, and we represent those in schema to the users. Developer-facing errors, on the other hand, we utilize the errors portion of a GraphQL response when there's something that the developer has done wrong in their implementation that they need to know about and fix for their application to keep working. Namespacing, this is a really big deal for us. We needed a way, particularly because we're dealing with a very large composed schema, a supergraph, to ensure that each different domain has their own bounded context that they can work within and ensure that whatever they are doing is not going to conflict or cause problems with what others are doing. So while it's a little bit of a pain to have namespaces on all of our types, it provides that safety and allows us to move fast and move forward and keep those boundaries in place so that you don't have to involve the entire organization anytime you want to come up with a new type or something. Naming conventions, as the old saying goes, the three hardest problems in computer science are naming things and off by one errors, right? So the naming conventions, this is one of those things where trying to identify early on just how you want to do these kinds of things allows you to have consistency over time rather than changing it every 6 months, something like that, and evolving it. So figuring that out early is a good idea. And then finally, how to orchestrate services. A lot of people who are not super familiar with GraphQL believe that it's going to solve the problems of how to be able to retrieve and sort and filter data from multiple different microservices in the back end. And that's not a GraphQL problem. That's just a data problem and how you access that and share it and so on. And so GraphQL isn't going to fix that for you, and you need to decide as an organization how you want to present data when it's coming from multiple sources on the back end, and make sure that the providers of that data are bought into that process so that you can present it cleanly. With that, I will hand it back to Suresh.
So the API guidelines that Jared talked about, that's not a static list of rules that we maintain, and they are not set in stone. We update these guidelines constantly as new use cases emerge, as well as when the developers, both producers, API producers, and consumers provide feedback. So we constantly listen to those feedback and update these guidelines as we see them as needed. And to put together all of this, here is our API tooling ecosystem. Our tooling ecosystem has templates, tools, services, and reviews. And we want to help the developers during our design and development phase. When they're designing the schema, as well as when they're developing the code to support that schema, and during the API review process, we want to be able to provide tools to help them align with these guidelines. And also, when they are ready to take the APIs to production, we want to help them publishing those. So our ecosystem supports all of these development phases for APIs. And in the templates, we have fully functional code templates. Code templates is an important aspect to get started for a new engineer who's starting in the company. As they implement a new service, these templates will provide code that aligns with our guidelines, so they can follow those guidelines, and they are not new to the guidelines that we have in the company. And throughout the process, we ensure that high quality of documentation is maintained for documentation purposes, as well as our review process. We consider the developer experience, how the developer is going to use this, how is the front-end tooling going to consume this, and the security, data classification, versioning, and among others, we consider all of this during the entire process. And the code templates that we have, they are updated with our API guidelines. So if there are any updates to the API guidelines, the templates also automatically get updated with these guidelines and best practices. And the generated code follow the schema first or the API first approach. So we have the code, the schema, the code that supports the schema, and the Jenkins file that verifies these, as well as the tests that are associated with these. So this is a complete package for anybody new coming in and trying to start a service and provide these APIs. They are following these guidelines. We are guiding them through this entire process. And we have also automated these validations. We have provided plugins, the IDE plugins, as they are designing and developing these APIs. There are IDE plugins that they can integrate in their IDE. We have for IntelliJ and Visual Studio Code. Those plugins validate the code against the schema. So if as they are designing the code, developing the schema, if there is a violation that's specified in the guidelines, they get the immediate feedback and they can update the code as they implement it. We have also invested in converting that into a GitHub app. So when they are submitting a pull request review, for example, these validations or linter rules are run against those. And before even get to a peer review, these guidelines are validated for the code changes that they are making in that PR. Also have tools, the standalone tools. We are using the open source GraphQL linter, but we have developed custom linter rules that follows our guidelines. So these guidelines validate that the guidelines that we have specified in the best practices are followed, and not all of the guidelines are automatable. So to the extent possible, we automate the guidelines and provide that as tools for our developers. And all the tools are backed by a service. We call this the API governance service. This is the brain behind these tools and linters. Let's see a quick demo of like how this is being done. Here's our internal developer portal. So when you are creating a new service, you would go ahead and create the service. So whether it is a GraphQL or a REST API, there are parameters that we get from that user for the developer. And for example, if you are developing a REST API service, there are functionalities provided for you. And for GraphQL API, for example, we use Netflix DGS as the backend. So we provide that auto-generated code for the developer to implement this. And here's the auto-generated code as a template as a starting point. We have schema, GraphQL schema, that aligns with the recommendation that we are doing. Use pagination, for example. This sample code has all of that built in. And so we use this to extend as the developers are adding functionality to the new API that they are going to be implementing. And also, we have the corresponding code, the implementation of it developed in providing an example of how to handle errors. When do you throw the developer errors versus the user errors? That's also implemented, and we have those test cases automated as part of our tooling. So this helps our developers to quickly start and implement these APIs. And these guidelines and tools and the automated reviews only help with the consistency of the APIs. So we are trying to make sure that across teams and developers are working on APIs, and when they are federated into a super graph, these APIs are consistent. So when the pagination input parameters are considered, they are consistent across these APIs. But we want to make these APIs consumable in addition to be consistent, and there's a big difference between consistent APIs and making it consumable APIs. To make that consumable APIs, we have this API review, or calls the API Jedi review, which is a manual review from the community, and we'll talk about that next.
All right. So yeah, training and community. So as Suresh mentioned, he brought up that term of an API Jedi. That sounds cool, right? Who wouldn't want to be a Jedi? So this is just a name that we've applied to our Champions program. So within Intuit, we had a program when it came to how we built our MSaaS infrastructure and everything that went into that, and we called it our MSaaS Jedi program, and we would bring people in, do an intensive 2-day training, get them essentially certified as an Intuit MSaaS Jedi, and then they could go back to their domains and they became that person who was an expert in their domain and be able to serve that domain and everybody in it without having to raise that up to a higher level to get approval and so on to move forth with how they architected and implemented things. Following that same pattern, we've implemented an API Jedi program, and so it's a company-wide program within Intuit with different verticals. I mentioned MSaaS, now we're doing API, and others are coming. But the key points of this are that we have training that you go through and requirements that must be met and nominations that are usually made so that not just anybody becomes a Jedi, because it gives you commit rights to the schema registry essentially for your domains. We take that seriously, and we want to make sure the person who's given that is going to take it seriously as well. And once you become a Jedi, there's some responsibilities that come along with that, to be on a committee that reviews questions and things that come up so that we can continue to refine our guidelines and things. And the important thing here is really just to establish a community where you have people regularly talking about these things. This is our Jedi flywheel. People can complete some kind of self-serve training, they shadow a mentor, they commit to some kind of responsibility. In ours, it's a rotating review rotation where they come in, and when people want to introduce new schema, they got to get some sign off from their domain expert, their API Jedi, and one other person. And you help grow that program. And just by having a regular practice of getting together with the individuals in your company who are those decision makers and kind of direction setters for how your API happens, that's going to start to bring everybody together onto the same page, make sure that as issues come up that they can be addressed quickly through Slack or in person or on calls. You get to get people for meetings, but making it a community that knows one another well will make it so much easier when problems or disagreements do come up to be able to resolve those in a good manner and do it quickly. So these are some of the considerations that you want to think about with your community and your training. I'm not going to go into detail on these. This is, if you have more questions here, this would really be for Lucy to dive into with you. With that, I think we are good. So thank you, and whatever time we have left, happy to answer any questions that you have. And otherwise, you can catch us after this during the break or later on today. Yes?
So when you first implemented this program, did you have any issues with
Great question. I'm going to repeat it just because I don't know if the recording, if that is helpful or not. So the question was, did we have any resistance to people wanting to be part of this or make it go forward and so on as we rolled it out? Did I capture that correctly? So I'll give my 2 cents and then let you, Suresh. So yes, I think luckily by the time we have rolled this out, rolling this out is something that's been kind of the culmination of a 2-ish year journey. And all along that 2 years, getting everybody into alignment and feeling good about the direction we were going. So that was a lengthy process. And what I can say there is, those tools that we had earlier with the DAISY and we built out squads and we bring in committees and work around these things. It just takes time. And so if you're in a larger organization and you are going to have pushback, you're going to have pushback, just start having those regular meetings, narrow focused topics. When you get stuck, what we have found works really well is pick 1 or 2 people to go away, work up a proposal and kind of the reason why, bring it back and then discuss that. If you try and do it with more than 2 or 3 people, it just becomes a discussion for an hour to 2 hours talking about it with no decisions ever reached. And so you got to time box it, assign it to a small group, bring them back. Then if you still can't agree as a group, you agree that at the end of that time box, that's when we escalate it up and we find someone who's willing to make that decision so we can all maybe disagree but still commit to the path forward. Do you have anything to add on that one?
No, I think you absolutely covered it, Jared. One philosophy that we follow is like if you want to, I think it's an African proverb on this, like if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go with the team.
Go together.
Go together, yes. So if you want, it depends on the problem, right? Like for these, we want these APIs to be long running and really serving a longer set of requirements. And if you want to come together as a team, that's when these APIs and guidelines help, and there are yes, initial resistances, but once you see the benefit of it, they will also start to contribute to this model.
Great question. Any others? Yes?
You talked about when you first joined, you did self-serve training, and then they go to a shadow. What does that shadow look like? Is this a pretty involved and consistent commitment from your members, or what is that sort of shadowing? Really entail like a day-to-day, is that week-to-week? What does that look like?
Yeah, great question. So to repeat it, earlier we showed that they complete the self-serve training and then they go through a mentorship basically. And what does that mentorship look like on a day-to-day, weekly, what's the commitment there? The way that it works for us today is we have a namespace repo where if somebody wants to join the federated or the composed GraphQL supergraph, they have to first identify a namespace that they're going to use for their types as a prerequisite to be able to come in. And then we also have, everybody has lots of repos, but there's then a schema review of what it is you're going to be putting in that compose. And so what the Jedis are doing is they are reviewing those namespace requests to make sure that they adhere to the guidelines we've given them. And then they're also reviewing the schema that they're going to be introducing. And for somebody who's a first time coming in, it's a much more critical review of that to make sure that we establish where there's any deviation from what we'd like them to do, and we discuss it if there's disagreement and so on. And that is where the mentorship comes in. So the person who's working to become will basically shadow and go and do those reviews together with that person. They'll do them offline together, they'll discuss it, and kind of the more senior Jedi will explain their rationale and thinking about it. The other one can participate. And then they, depending upon how involved it is, they meet with that team and go over their opinions and give the final sign off and work with them to make adjustments. And so we try and do that with a new Jedi, however long we feel it's kind of necessary. We're still kind of working that out as we go, but eventually they just start to get to where they feel like, okay, I'm ready to start taking some of these on my own. Thank you. I'll repeat it, and I'll let you have a first crack at it, and then I'll go after if you want. So repeating the question is, with the namespace, that can encourage duplications of types in the schema, but with federation, we're trying to not have duplication of types, but just be able to extend a single type is kind of the idea. And so how do we deal with that is the question. Did I capture that correctly? Okay, so on this one, so again, Intuit's got a lot of things that are duplicated, but they're usually not exact duplicates. They're partial duplicates. And so we have this activity going on all the time. I came to Intuit, by the way, through an acquisition, and we partition things up into capabilities. And I would say out of our 10-ish capabilities, I'd say 6 of them at least are clones to some degree with what is already inside of Intuit. But they're not exact replacements for what we have, and so we have to keep ours going at the same time that these other ones are going, while we then embark upon a journey with the other capability owner and our capability owners to say, how do we harmonize this? How do we reduce this down to a single capability? And it's usually not something that can be done overnight. It's going to take who knows how long. It could be a year or more. And so while that state exists, we need that ability to have different and overlapping types. I'll take an employee for an example. Every product in Intuit has their own employee entity, pretty much. We've got a payroll employee, we've got a time tracking employee, we've got an accounting employee, we've got all these different things, and each of them have different fields, and so it would make sense, for example, to say, well, the fields are the same, let's identify who the source, the master source of that data is, let them establish that entity, and everybody else will just extend off of that. Well, what we found is we kind of take what we call a crawl, walk, run approach. The crawl stage is each of you within your namespace establish your entity type. So we have a payroll employee and a time tracking employee as an example. They may have some overlapping field names. We're currently, then we get out of so in the crawl phase, they can coexist. They may be duplicate. So you could say, I want the first name of a payroll employee or a time tracking employee, and they should be the same value, and they are, because we take care of that on the back end, keeping them in sync. So then the walk phase is to start to identify which of the two should be the source, and once that's identified, any duplicate fields are removed from the ones that are not the source. So now we have the payroll employee that's going to be the source of truth, for example. It has the first name and last name. We'll remove those fields off of the time tracking employee and keep the things that are just relevant to time, but they're still separate entities and related to one another. The run phase is where we actually say, okay, now we'll deprecate that time tracking employee and just make those fields part of the payroll employee over time. And we're actually kind of in between the crawl and the walk phase with that example I gave you right now. And don't know if it's going to make sense to go to that run phase, because as soon as you combine entities coming from different microservices on the back end, now you have to deal with things like, if I want a version string on that entity, does that mean my 2 back-end services need to have something going on to have a shared version string? And there's a lot of complexities there that may not really matter to the consumer, because they just want to be able to get the data. As long as they're related to one another in the graph, it's probably fine to have 2 entities. So those are the discussions we're having right now. Sorry, long-winded answer, but I'm passionate about that one, if you can't tell. Any other questions? Yes.
So anyone in the company can become an API Jedi?
You want to take that one? The question was, can anybody in the company become an API Jedi?
Yes, yeah. We want to encourage everyone in the company, mainly engineers working on the APIs, to go through the training, the self-serve training that we talked about, just to make sure that we are familiar with the guidelines, and also it helps you with during the review process, or when you are doing a peer review, or even you are implementing this APIs. And the commitment to become an API Jedi requires certain areas and time commitments, and if you're going through that phase, we encourage people to go through and become an API Jedi.
Follow-up question. So if everyone in the company can become a Jedi, when you have these initial schema reviews, how do you make sure that this is like you have the best quality? Because if if community grows, you kind of lose control over it, right? So someone not very experienced may review your schema
Yeah, so how do we manage that quality if we let everybody become an API Jedi? And maybe it's a clarification of what Suresh was sharing is that while anybody is encouraged and can go through that path to become an API Jedi, one of the final pieces of that is that the architect for a domain has to give the final sign off on somebody becoming a Jedi. Other than that, they stay what we call a Padawan, which means they've done the training, they know everything, and they can have meaningful conversations, but they don't get that commit privilege unless they're an actual Jedi, and that is a gate that's controlled by the architect of that domain. So we want a lot, but not too many. So that's what helps. Yep.
Do you have Sith
Sith
Lords?
Lords? I think we're going to have to find a spot for that. That's a great question. We have one question here, and then we'll come back to this one. Yes.
This is kind of related to an answer to an earlier question. You mentioned that when making kind of discussions as a group, you select 2 to 3 people to kind of go and make a proposal. How do you select those 2 or 3 people? Are those members of the team that are implementing a particular feature? Is that a platforming team that you guys have? I'm just curious on how that decision is made and who's the owner of some of those proposals that are being made.
Great question. So the question, just to repeat it again, is that when we formed those, when we were working on decisions, we needed those 2 or 3 to go away and come back with a proposal. How do we select who those 2 or 3 would be? So just based on our experience, so Suresh and I have been part of this committee. We've got some others in the room, Ashpak and Rama in the back that are part of these as well. So we call them squads or committees. But these, we first form a squad or a committee, usually anywhere from 5 to 8 or 9 people that are tasked with moving an initiative forward and getting some of these things done. When something comes up that there are, maybe there's not a direct path forward, we kind of divvy that up, and we try to build the council or that committee up of individuals that have diverse experiences and represent different areas of the company and different products and things like that. And then when it comes time to do something, it's usually kind of obvious, either because somebody has a particular area of expertise in something like, or knowledge about it, that we can say, hey, will you be the driver on this? And either go on your own or pick 1 or 2 people from this committee, and people will usually raise their hands if they're super interested. And then we try and keep that small, like, okay, in order to let you guys move fast, let's just limit it to these 2 or 3 people. We'll all have a chance to discuss it when they come back. And the committee generally has a chair identified, or a squad has a leader, and that leader or that chair is the one who's responsible for making sure that we're assigning these things out in a way that will ensure that they're going to have the resourcing needed to get it done. So you don't want to give it to somebody who has absolutely no context for what you're asking them to do. Pick somebody that can be part of that. It's great because there's a lot of opportunities for growth, as well as there's opportunities to just leverage what's already there, and you just kind of take it as it comes. Yeah. And we have a question here.
Do you apply the same API governance to both internal schemas and public schemas? And like kind of a follow-up to that, like if you do apply to the internal schemas, like how do you make it so that the development feedback cycles can continue to be quick and not kind of get bogged down in too much red tape?
Thank you for the question. So the question was, do we apply the same rigor and cycles for both internal and external? And if we do, then how do we make sure that we don't get bogged down, especially because it's usually a little bit more difficult with external to make things run fast and so on. So do you have an opinion that you'd like to share
I can
first?
start. Okay. Yeah. We want all our APIs to be external or public ready from day one. Right? We want to approach any API with that philosophy. So defining these guidelines help those so that we are all aligned, and there are aspects of these guidelines that make sure that when these APIs are public, they are easily consumable and consistent with other APIs. But we also want to make sure that whether it is an internal API or a public API or partners API, they are all consistent and easy to adopt. And when we are taking an internal API to public, there is not a whole lot of effort to cross that bridge. So we encourage that from the beginning, and these API guidelines help a lot.
Yeah, just to double down on what Suresh said, ideally, external ready from day one, like always have that mindset so that you can just flip a switch to turn it on for external. It does slow things down a little bit, but and it's in pockets. Like it'll go slow at first, but then as people get into that habit, it goes faster, and you kind of have to go through that process with each one that you're working with. And we're still, this is because we haven't exposed anything externally yet, except for a few select partners and very narrow in scope. This is something we're going to have to figure out as we go. And we're not the experts on it yet, but those are our thoughts so far on how we can handle it. Excellent. Yes. He said, can you give a range of what slow and faster means? This is hard for me because I came from a startup world, and now I'm in a larger corporate world, and they're very, very different from one another. And so, yeah, I will hold off giving comment. I'll let Suresh give an opinion, and if there are others, but I guess slow to fast, it's relative, and I can say that in today's environment that I'm in, slow is that it can take a year or more to get something out. Fast is it can take a quarter or two to get something out. So startup world, it would be more like, weeks versus months kind of thing. So that's the necessity of when you have a large organization.
No.
All right, I think we're probably over time at this point. We'll go ahead and we'll close, and we'll be available, though, for anybody else who has other things they want to talk about. Thanks.